So questions 1 and 2, we have to identify the characteristics of the quadratic function and its graph. So it gives us the graph. So the very highest point, so think of like the mountaintop or like the valley of your parabola has the vertex. Here we have a valley. So our vertex would be at the very lowest point. What is our vertex? Like the lowest point. Awesome. 2, 4. Now our axis of symmetry is always x equals, think axis has an x. X equals, what's the x in our vertex?
2.
2. So x equals 2. Our domain is always all real numbers. So domain is always all real numbers. It's always going to be all real numbers.
What's a real number?
We're just talking about real numbers here, not imaginary numbers.
So it could be like anything but 0?
Just write all real numbers.
No matter what?
For domain. That's always the domain.
Oh, the test is going to ask us.
Yep.
Domain, spread that.
Mm-hmm. For the range, we're talking about y values. So a couple things we have to include here. We want to include our y value from the vertex. So that would be 4. And now we have to look at our graph. Does our graph point up or point down? Up. So we're talking about values that are greater than 4. So y values greater than 4. You could say y is greater than 4 if you wanted to. So either way, you can put it in words or you can use the greater than symbol. Y is greater than 4. And then we want to talk about increasing and decreasing. So just like how we read from left to right, we read a graph going from left to right. So if I started at the left and I worked my way to the right, would I be walking uphill or downhill? Downhill. So we'd be decreasing on what side of our vertex? The left side or the right side?
Left.
So we're walking downhill, so we're decreasing on the left side of our vertex. So we're decreasing left, which means we're increasing to the right. All right, let's do the same thing with number 2. What's our vertex here?
1.5. No, half.
What's our x value? -3, comma, what's the y? -1. Because we go down, it looks like 1/2, but it's halfway to 2, which would be 1.
Oh, 3 is x.
So this would be 1, 2, 3, 4,
Yeah.
5, 6.
Yeah, is it going to be like that on the test?
It might. Just pay attention to the numbers. All right, axis of symmetry is x equals, what does our x equal?
-3.
-3. Domain is what?
All real numbers.
All real numbers.
No matter what.
You can say all real numbers. You can say ARN if you want to abbreviate. All real numbers. Our range.
Why is this the negative?
Awesome. We're talking about the y value. So y is, our graph is going down. So is it less than or greater than? Less than. So y is less than -1. Or you could say y value is less than -1. Now for increasing and decreasing, we start at the left, just like how you read a sentence going from left to right. Would we be walking uphill or downhill? Uphill. So we're increasing on which side of our vertex? The left side. So we're increasing on the left side and decreasing on the right. All right, for the next 4 questions, 3, 5, 7, and 6, we are going to put those on the graphs down below, but let's look at 9 and 10 before we go to the next page. So here we want to describe the transformation of the graph and then write the equation that represents g in terms of x. So when we add 3 to our graph, what does that do to it? So plus 3 means that we're moving it up 3. And then when we add 3, so it just wants us to add 3 to our function here to f of x, so we're going to say plus 3. We just need to combine our like terms. So this would be 4x squared plus, what's 1 plus 3? 4. So that would be our new graph. So we don't have to graph it, we're just adding 3 to it. For 10, we're subtracting 3. Yep, that would be. Part of the answer is up 3, because it's kind of two parts to this question. It says describe the transformation, so that would mean that we go up 3. And then when it says write an equation that represents g in terms of x, that would be our new equation here. Yeah, two parts of the answer. So same thing with number 10. Two parts to this question. We have to describe the transformation. So what is minus 3? Shifts it down 3. So that's the first part of our answer. And then when we subtract 3 from it, we get 1/4 x squared. What's negative 5 minus 3? So minus 8. Perfect. And this would be our new equation. You guys don't have to do 13. If you did it, good job. But don't worry about it. Don't have to do 13. So no word problems. Let's look at our graphs for 3, 5, 6, and 7. So on the next page. Starting with number 3, I'm going to make a table here. So we're going to plug in values for x into our equation, negative 2x squared. And we're going to get values for, it calls it h of x, which is just our y. And then we're going to have our points x comma h of x, which is just x comma y. Well, that is crooked, but let's plug in values for x. So we always want to plug in, I'll tell you on the quiz tomorrow how many values, depending on how many questions we have. So either 3 or 5 numbers. Let's start by plugging in 5. So we'll plug in negative 2, negative 1, 0, 1, and 2. So we're going to plug it into our x. So here, it's just when you plug it in, make sure you follow your order of operations. So we have negative 2 times negative 2 squared. I put them there. So anytime you do these, you want to plug in values for x. So these are good numbers to start. You want to plug in a couple negatives and a couple positives and 0.
So it doesn't matter what numbers. You could put negative 3, negative
Doesn't matter what numbers, but stick with something close to 0, because if you plugged in like 10, when you do 10 squared, you're going to get 100, and it's going to be way off of your graph. So I would always plug in these numbers.
Can positive go with a negative?
Sure, you can plug it in whatever order you want. It's going to end up in the same shape on your graph, so it doesn't matter.
1, 2, 0, negative 2, and negative 1.
Sure. All right, so let's do the math. What is negative 2 squared? Negative 2 times negative 2. Negative 2 squared would be positive 4. And negative 2 times positive 4? Negative 8. So our y is negative 8. So our point here would be negative 2 comma negative 8. So let's go to our graph. We're going to go to the left to negative 2. And then which way do I go to go negative 8?
Right.
If I go to the left to negative 2, then which way?
Down.
Down to negative 8. So that would be our first point. Let's plug in negative 1. So we have negative 2 times negative 1 squared. What do we have to do first here, according to PEMDAS?
Exponents.
The exponent. So what's negative 1 squared?
4.
Negative 1 times negative 1.
2.
Negative 1 times negative 1.
Negative. What? Oh, 1.
Positive 1. So negative 2 times 1 is negative 2. So we get negative 2 for our y. So what would our point be here? Negative 1 comma negative 2. So we're going to go to the left to negative 1 and down negative 2. Next, let's plug in 0. So we have negative 2 times 0 squared. What's 0 squared?
0.
0. And negative 2 times 0?
0.
0. So we get 0. What would our point here be?
0, 0.
0, 0. So we're going to put a point at 0, 0. And then let's plug in 1. We have negative 2 times 1 squared. What's 1 squared?
1.
And negative 2 times 1?
1.
Negative 2. So we got negative 2. What would our point here be?
1, 2.
1, negative 2. So we're going to go to the right 1 and down negative 2. And then let's plug in 2. So we have negative 2 times 2 squared. What's 2 squared?
4.
So negative 2 times 4 would be
8.
negative 8. So what's our point?
2, 8.
2, negative 8. So we're going to go to the right 2 and down to negative 8. What shape does our graph have to have? A U shape. So here it's an upside down U. So that would be our parabola. It's a U shape. So make sure when you connect the dots, you connect it in a U shape. If you have a point up here and a point down here and a point over here, your graph isn't going to have a U shape. So maybe you did something wrong. So just be careful. Let's find all of the important information from our graph. So let's find our vertex, our axis of symmetry. There will be questions that you'll have to do this for on the quiz. Some might just be just graph, but just for extra practice, we're going to find the important stuff here. So vertex, axis of symmetry, domain, range, and increasing and decreasing. What would our vertex be here? 0, 0. Awesome. That is the very highest point of our graph. Bless you. 0, 0. What is our axis of symmetry? Awesome. X equals 0. It's always the x value from our vertex. What's our domain? All real numbers. Domain is always all real numbers. Axis of symmetry is the x value. Range, are we talking about y values that are greater than 0 or less than 0? So y is less than 0. Awesome, because our graph is pointing down, so we're talking about less than 0. Now for increasing and decreasing, we start at the left side. Would we be walking uphill or downhill? We're increasing on which side of our graph? The left side, so increasing on the left and then decreasing on the right. So when you read a graph, just like how you read a sentence, you go from left to right. So we start at the left side. When we're going along our graph, we're walking uphill. So even though that the arrow points down, think about it as if you're walking along the mountain, walking from left to right. We're walking uphill.
What would one like increasing right? Like, what would that look like?
If you had one that looked like this, and then here, when we walk along the graph, we're walking downhill. So we'd be decreasing on the left, increasing right. Any questions here? All right, let's do it again. Let's look at number 5. So I'm going to start with my chart here. Hopefully I can make it a little bit neater. A little bit better. So we have our values for x. We're going to plug them into 2x squared minus 10 into our equation. We're going to get values for y, which here it uses r of x. So then our point's going to be x, comma, r of x. You don't need to worry about the r of x. This is just a fancy way of saying y. So our point is just x, comma, y, just like how we normally do. It just kind of puts the other letter in there to make it fancy. So let's plug in, we're going to plug in the same numbers, -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. So starting with -2, We have 2 times negative 2 squared minus 10. What do we have to do first here? The exponent. What's negative 2 squared? 4. So we have 2 times 4 minus 10. What's 2 times 4? And what's 8 minus 10? Negative 2. So we got negative 2 for our y. What would our point be here? Negative 2 comma negative 2. Awesome. So let's put that on our graph. Which direction are we going to go? Where would we plot this point? How do we put the point? Negative 2 comma negative 2. So we're going to go to the left to negative 2 and down negative 2. What do we do next? Let's plug in negative 1. So 2 times negative 1 squared minus 10. Make sure you follow your order of operations. Have to do the exponent first. What's negative 1 squared? 1. 2 times 1 would be, and 2 minus 10? Negative 8. So what would our point here be? Negative 1 comma negative 8. So we're going to go to our graph. We go to the left to negative 1 and down negative 8. Let's plug in 0. So we have 2 times 0 squared minus 10. What's 0 squared? 0. And what's 2 times 0? What's 0 minus 10? Negative 10. So here, our point would be 0 comma negative 10. So we're going to stay at 0 and go down to negative 10. Then what do we plug in? 1. So 2 times 1 squared minus 10. 1 squared is 1. 2 times 1 would be 2. And 2 minus 10? Negative 8. Chris, what's our point here?
Negative 8. I mean 1 negative 8.
1 comma negative 8. So we're going to go to the right 1 and down negative 8.
Well, can't you just make the dot like above the one you already made, like in a line with the other one? Like, can't you just put it at negative 2 too?
So technically, our next point's going to be at positive 2, negative 2. Because we know that we have an axis of symmetry that goes right through it, and our graph's going to be symmetrical. But just in case that our first point was not in the right spot, let's just plug in the numbers anyways. I need to see your work. So make sure you plug in all the numbers to show your work. So 2 times 2 squared minus 10 would be 2 times 4 minus 10. What's 8 minus 10? Negative 2. So our point here would be 2 comma negative 2, exactly like we said it would be. What's the shape that our graph makes? A U shape. So make sure all your points are in line for a U shape. Now let's find all the important information from our graph too, just to practice. So we need vertex, axis of symmetry.
Is it going to be written on the test already?
Yeah. If the question asks for it, it'll be written on the test.
Not all the math work.
We need the domain, the range, and increasing and decreasing. All right, Dylan, what's the vertex?
Negative 10, negative 10.
So what would the point be?
Negative 10. 0. 0, negative 10.
0 comma negative 10.
Good job, Alex.
How do you know which one you use?
The bottom is lowest point.
No, it's either higher.
It's either if it opens down, use the point at the top. If it opens up, use the point at the bottom. So the one that's in the very middle of the graph. What would our axis of symmetry be? X equals, what's our X value in this point?
0.
X equals 0. What's our domain?
All real numbers.
All real numbers. So we can say ARN.
Y,
Range.
Y is bigger than negative 10.
Awesome. We're going to say Y is greater than negative 10.
Because it's going up, right?
Because our graph opens up. Yep. And then for increasing and decreasing, we're going to draw our little person starting at the left side. Would our person be walking uphill or downhill along our graph? Downhill. So we're decreasing on the left. And then increasing on the right. If you guys do it correctly, this will be the last one. Yes. If we see that we all know what we're doing, we'll stop here. But if it seems like you're still not sure, we'll do the rest of them. All right, so we're plugging in values for X. We're gonna plug in -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. We're plugging it into 1/4 times X squared. We're gonna get values for our Y, or you can call it G of X, and then our point is gonna be X comma Y. Yeah, just because that's the name that it uses, you can call it whatever you want. This is just a fancy way of saying Y. So same thing. So let's start by plugging in -2. We have 1/4 times -2 squared. What do we do first? Parentheses or the exponent here. So what's -2 to the second power? -2 times -2. Positive 4. Be careful on the quiz tomorrow. What's 1/4 times 4? So be careful. 4 would be 4 over 1. You multiply straight across. So it'd be 4 over 4, which simplifies to 1. So our Y would be 1. So our point here is -2, comma 1. Does that make sense? Okay. So we're going to go to the left to -2 and up 1. Next, let's plug in -1. So we have 1/4 times -1 squared. What's -1 squared? 1. And what's 1/4 times 1? 1/4. So we get 1/4. So what's our point here going to be? -1, comma 1/4. So we're going to go to the left to -1 and up 1/4. So barely off of the graph there. About 1/4 of the way to 1. Now let's plug in 0. We have 1/4 times 0 squared. 0 squared is 0. And what's 0 times 1/4? 0. So our point here would be 0, comma 0. So we put a point at 0, 0. Now let's plug in 1. We have 1/4 times 1 squared. 1 squared would be 1. And 1/4 times 1 is 1/4. So 1, comma 1/4. So we're going to do the right one and up 1/4. And then lastly, let's plug in 2. We have 1/4 times 2 squared. 2 squared is 4. And what's 1/4 times 4? 1. Awesome. It'd be 4 over 4, which simplifies to 1. So our point would be 2, comma 1. Perfect. So we're going to go to the right 2 and up 1. What shape does our graph make? A U. Here it's kind of a wide U, but it is a U. Let's find all of our important information here. We need to find our vertex, the axis of symmetry, the domain, range, if it's increasing or where it's increasing and decreasing. Okay, so what's our vertex?
0,
0, 0. Awesome. What is our axis of symmetry? x equals 0. Do not forget the x equals. Remember, axis has an x, so x equals. You needed the x equals 0 in your answer. What's our domain? All real numbers. You can abbreviate if you want. You can say ARN.
1, 0.
Y is greater than 0. We're talking about y values greater than 0 for our range. Perfect, because our graph is pointing up. And then let's draw our person. So we start at the left. Are we walking uphill or downhill?
Downhill.
Downhill, so we're decreasing on which side? Decreasing on the left, so we'd be increasing on the right. Let's look at one more thing. So going back to number 5, our graph for number 5. If this said to identify the transformations, kind of like number 9 and 10, when we subtract 10 from our graph, what does that do to it? Moves it which way?
Middle.
Moves it down how many?
10.
Down 10. So if it asks for the transformation, you want to see what are you adding or subtracting, and that's what moves your graph. So we shift it. It could ask for transformation or shifts. Just same thing. We'd go down 10. So if you're adding or subtracting, you're moving it up or down.